So I assume everybody had a great lunch, spent time reviewing the proposal, getting familiar with it again, because reading it once is not enough. You've got to read this one multiple times. This is just one you can't put down. So just to kind of get us caught back up, before lunch we talked a bit about some of the needs assessments and requirements that the ISO is working on setting up for flexible RA. And so then the big question comes in, that's great. How do I provide and meet that requirement and have procurement to do so? So we wanted to go through here and talk about trying to establish some minimum criteria and eligibility for providing flexible RA and trying to improve some of the validation processes we're doing on some of the EFC counting to make sure that we have all of the information reported to us. So we started out in trying to establish some criteria, and one of the concessions I'll make up front is that we recognize and acknowledge. Okay? Just checking. Okay. We recognize the criteria that we've outlined here is not complete. There's gaps within it that we're still working on filling and trying to address. We're going to be trying to work with stakeholders to do that. But again, what we've got here are elements of eligibility that are clearly measurable and verifiable. Some of the things we had, for example, the requirement for 2 starts per day or 2 ramps per day was really kind of a tough nut to crack in the original flexibility space, which is to say, well, am I eligible for category 1 or 2? I have startup times of this. I only have 1 start because of how long it takes me to start. Can I still provide that base ramping flexible capacity? Well, we're looking to simplify that down. So at its core, we'll start with the criteria for providing the forecastable flexible capacity needs. So this is going to be the long ramp and the fast ramping products, not the uncertainty products. We're looking at resources that are non-use limited resources or use limited resources that we can model the use limitations either through our market or through an opportunity cost adder. So that means if you have like a daily start limitation, that's a use limitation we can model through our market. If you have a starts per year limitation, that's something that we can model through the opportunity cost adder for efficient dispatch resource. And so, that's the type of model or the resource that we can model through the opportunity cost. So you have to be one of those types of resources. If you can't model the opportunity cost or the use limitation, we'll struggle much more with having that resource providing flexibility and not having concerns that we may dispatch it suboptimally over too short a period of time, use up whatever use limitations it has. As it is today, we're still relying on the resources being dispatchable. So non-dispatchable resources are a no-go for FlexRA. The conditionally available resources, this is a new term in the ISO tariff. These are basically use-limited resources where the use limitation is really kind of difficult to capture and model. And so we limit the eligibility for the conditionally available resources. And then finally, because of the stated need earlier that we're focusing on the tertiary product and not having something that focuses specifically on regulation, not being a REM resource is another criteria that we've outlined here. So again, I know that we currently allow for NGR REMs to provide FlexRA. Moving forward, that would not be the case. So then moving on to the criteria for providing for the uncertainty product. Again, at a minimum, we'd like the resources to be able to meet the qualifications for the forecastable requirements so that any resource that can provide the uncertainty product, at least at our initial take, would also probably have the ability to provide the forecastable one. If we're missing something there, i.e. a resource that can meet the uncertainty one but not the other ones, please let us know so we can contemplate that more but we hadn't identified one. So meeting the minimum requirements of the forecastable, and then meeting the definition of short start resource. Again, that's a resource that can be cycled in our stuck horizon. So again, because this is uncertainty, we're looking at having resources that, oh, we didn't know we needed that resource online yesterday. We're seeing the need for it coming into the real-time markets, so having the ability to have commitments as well as the dispatch. We thought was an important element of this. We want it to be dispatchable in at least 15 minutes. There are a couple resource types out there that they're looking for still maintaining like hourly block schedules, some of the DR resources, for example, some of the imports, and we'll talk a little bit more detail about those in a little bit. And then must be reasonably able to control the fuel source. Again, this is a bit of an amorphous term, but it's a question of, for example, if you can't control the sun or the wind, or if you can't necessarily control the water or even, quite frankly, the natural gas flow, this is a resource that we need to have a fair amount of controllability over, and so we need to know that they have control of their fuel source. We will, again, work to clarify that, but these are, as we start off, the initial eligibility criteria that we're putting forward out there. Now I'm seeing some looks, head nods, and head shakes out there, so I'm going to pause for questions right now.
Yeah, Peter Griffiths, PG&E. In the next iteration, could you provide the rationale for why each of these types of resources or conditions are needed to be able to provide the flexible product that you're needing?
Sure. Again, I thought we provided some rationale for them in the paper. I'm just trying to remember what the final version came out at. But if it's insufficient at this point in time, we can add to it. That's fine. Okay. Question on the phone then. Caller?
Hey, Carl. Matt Barnett from Calpine.
Go ahead, Matt.
So I actually had a couple of questions and comments. So maybe piling on Peter's comment a little bit. I don't understand the justification for limiting the resources that can provide the uncertainty product just to short start resources, because obviously you can commit longer start resources day ahead to be available to address uncertainty. That's just one comment. And then back on
on that, Matt, can I chime in just really quick? At the end of the day, I honestly understand that question and concern. I think as we further develop the imbalanced reserve product, that'll help us to contemplate how strongly we need to back that requirement. So again, if we've made that commitment or we have that product in place, that may facilitate expanding that eligibility. But until we've got more on that, we're kind of taking a little more conservative approach just in case.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think it could use a little bit more justification, and then similarly, I guess on the previous slide, maybe or one before it, I'm not sure how the use limited resources would, even if you can, model the opportunity costs associated with their use limits, how those help you meet ramps that say happen every day. If the resource would exhaust its use limits if it were used every day.
Good question, Matt. I think it's going to get to a question of, at that point in time, how would we then treat that use limited reached status? Would we continue to exempt it from some of the outage and replacement provisions, or would we look at that as something different, as a forced outage potentially if they've relied on that and derate the capacity? But that's a fair point. Thank you.
Okay, and then just one more thing, and I'm sorry that I didn't jump in before lunch, but I'm actually wondering whether the uncertainty needs, if you're procuring to meet the 3 hour and the 1 hour, whether the uncertainty is embedded in that already, And I guess what I'm thinking is, you're determining those needs based on, kind of the maximum ex post realized ramps, and those probably occur when the forecast error was high. So you can have sort of an average forecast and a high forecast error that will get you to a really high ramp. But you probably don't have sort of a high measured ex post ramp, and then also the need to cover uncertainty on top of that. I don't know if I'm articulating that well, but I think there's a difference between ex post and ante, and ex post. If you're using sort of the worst outcome, then the uncertainty that you're worried about may be in that already.
I think the answer is it may be, and when we get into some of the offer obligations here in a moment, the answer may be more that maybe it's already in there. Interestingly enough, what we're seeing, if you look at just some of the preliminary analysis we had done in the day-ahead imbalance, or day-ahead market enhancements for the imbalanced reserve, or whether it was day-ahead FRP at the time, I don't remember what we were calling it during that particular iteration, but we're seeing deviations between IFM and FMM in the neighborhood of about 4,000 to 5,000 megawatts, and as we showed earlier, the 1 hour net load ramp is also, I think, now in about the 5,500 range. There's concerns that, yes, that ramp may be larger today, but as we have more uncertain variable resources on the fleet tomorrow, the uncertainty element may actually grow beyond this single observed 1 hour ramp. And so having them as separate requirements is something that we've laid out today, simply because we're actually concerned of the other occurring tomorrow, which is to say that the time in which we need that flexibility is A, outside of that 1 hour ramp window, and B, actually is more than a single ramp that we see, because, again, how you measure that number matters.
Yeah, I could see how one might be bigger than the other, but I guess, I'm not convinced one way or another, but I'm concerned that they might be overlapping. They shouldn't be treated as additive.
No, and we won't have them additive. We'll talk a bit more about how the showings will occur and the accounting will occur. They're not additive requirements. We'll actually, just as we do today relative to system and flexible, we'll assess these independent of one another.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions in the room? Seeing none.
Operator, do we have anybody else in the queue?
We do have one more caller on the phone.
Thank you.
Go ahead, caller.
Yeah, hi, Carl. This is Sandeep Arora with LS Power. I had a question on your previous slide. Okay, maybe not. Not this slide. The slide where you talked about the NGR, or I guess the REM resources are not
yes.
not qualify. Okay, there you go. Thank you. So I was, little puzzled by this. So I understand. I think initially you explained the primary and secondary and tertiary, requirements, and how the primary response, frequency response, you're not procuring for that. There's already product or expectation. Secondary is your regulation product, and you're not really procuring FlexRA for that because there's already a product there. And tertiary is what you're focusing on. One thing I just would like to point, so regulation, by that concept, I understand where you're coming from, that regulation energy management is, I guess, those resources that provide only reg up and reg down, and hence, by definition, would not qualify for FlexRA. I guess one thing I would just point out here is if you are a storage project, you often have to make a choice. You can either participate as REM or you can participate as an NGR. You can't do both, and there's a master file change and a few other changes that need to take from one status to the other. I think by including this as a criteria, or I guess excluding these resources from providing FlexRA, you might be inadvertently disincentivizing, these resources to provide the flexible capacity and quite frankly, the dispatch that they provide to CAISO today. I mean, these resources do collect capacity payment, but at the end of the day, they do take a lot of risk as well because they are subject to CAISO dispatch, which may or may not be in their favor. It really depends on your energy pricing and so on. So, again, I think, if these resources cannot sell FlexRA, then there is a disincentive for them. So I would just, ask CAISO to reconsider this exception here.
I think the best way to help us with that, Sandeep, is to clarify what that disincentive is in your comments, and we'll take a look at it. We've looked at the reason why we went to and included REM in the first place, in the first instance, and that was the idea that it would free up other capacity to provide ramping capability. And our current thinking is, again, we're not looking for regulation as a capacity product, but also if there's another resource that's providing ramping capabilities, then maybe that should be the resource that's getting the flexible RA capabilities as well. Again, it's not to say that we don't have a need for and benefit for regulation, and we get that through our market dispatches. We're just not seeing that as the RA product that we're needing to have procured. But again, please let us know in comments a little bit more about the disincentive you're talking about, and we'll take that into consideration.
Yeah, we'll definitely do that, Carl. I think the distinction really is REM resource, storage REM resource can only either do REM or NGR versus other resources might be able to do both. So anyways, we'll provide more clarity in our comments.
Outstanding. Thank you, Sandeep. Okay. So let's move on to some of the gaps that we realize some of these eligibility criteria have. And, part of what we addressed in FRACMU, I said it. I thought I was going to make it through. Part of what we said in our previous iterations on FlexRA was trying to address some of the energy needs and energy limitations that came with some of the hydro resources with reservoirs, as well as some of the NGR resources. The criteria that we've laid out here don't account for those energy limitations. So, for example, we're not looking at and establishing kind of a minimum threshold for how many megawatt hours a battery or hydro with a reservoir would have to have. Previously we had said, I think it was 6 hours for the base ramping flexible capacity, I think 3 hours for the peak and super peak. We've not made those energy limitation specifications here. We are concerned about them. So we're kind of putting this out there not as something we have resolution to, but something we're looking for stakeholders to help us think about how we would consider energy limitations and how we would confirm and validate those. Again, that's one of the challenges we've had, is what the validation processes look like now for those limitations. We also recognize that there's no requirement for starts or ramping frequency as we currently have today. Part of that is because what we're seeing now is that there's, the morning ramps are not what they used to be. We're starting to see the percentage of flexible RA needs today. The base ramping product has really gone down significantly as a percentage of the overall need, which is not to say we don't need resources that are capable of 2 ramps per day. It's just less than it once was. But under these requirements, as I noted earlier, the standard is, it was very tough for us to validate, and it was very unclear. We got calls every year, am I category 1 or category 2? Can you ramp twice a day? Well, what does that mean? So trying to think about what the starts and ramp frequency is still a question that remains for us. So again, I can pause for stakeholder comments on that now. If anybody's got a solution to that off the cuff, that's great. Otherwise, I was going to continue moving because I didn't figure anybody was going to have a solution to it off the cuff. Okay. All right. So let's keep moving again because I do want to note that we are still technically behind schedule. We're also concerned about having resources that receive day-ahead awards, for example, for an afternoon commitment coming back into the real time, again with offer obligations to continue to participate, and then having a start come in being dispatched in the morning, and now the question is, will the resource be available for its afternoon commitment, or will we have to ED it on through the day? How will we manage that? Again, having 2 starts per day made that very easy, very clear. But again, to Matt's point earlier, to stuff I had already said, it was difficult to validate in that upfront showing what that meant and how that would work. So again, stepping back from that, saying we know we're going to need to have resources that can be flexible. We're trying to set up our offer obligations to comport with the needs. We'll get to that in a moment. We're seeing those kind of spread out, but we want to continue to make that simplistic as far as not having a plethora of offer obligations, because that was the other thing that was very confusing. So once we've determined that resources are eligible for an EFC, and again, we won't calculate an EFC for resources that are not eligible, we'll provide 3 EFC values for each resource. We'll provide the capabilities for 15-minute, 1 hour, and 3 hours. And we're going to try and simplify that down as far as the calculations go. We had all sorts of really wonky rules about weighted average ramp rates over some 3-hour period and trying to figure out what portions and sections of the segments of the resource that contemplated. And I think the answer is, wow, that was way more complicated than it needed to be. So we're going to make that easier. We're not going to consider for eligibility purposes the P-min and startup times anymore, or the weighted average ramp rate. We're going to keep it much more simplistic. The EFC for most resources, there are a couple exceptions to this, would be capped at the resource's unforced capacity level. We'll be looking at that from a cold start value as well. I probably should have had some bullet. The P-min of the resource, though, cannot be split. And what we mean by this is we're going to really be looking at the measurement of the resource over a given time interval. And so since we're looking at over a time interval, we're going to say, what can you do for over a 3-hour, 1 hour, and 15-minute interval? If over some portion of that your P-min is included in it, all of your P-min will be included in that calculation. We can't say, well, we're going to get half of your P-min. That's not how our dispatches work. Minimum bids into the ISO market are to the P-min of the resource. We cannot say we'll dispatch you for part of the minimum operating level. It's not a feasible dispatch. So what we're getting at with that is simply to say that if your P-min is in any segment of the calculation, the entirety of P-min will be covered in that. So if you have a 2-hour startup time and your P-min is, but you can ramp very quickly over the last hour, we may find that that's what your 1-hour capability is, but your P-min may impact what you can do for the 3-hour period. We may capture that in there. It may be much slower because we can't divide it in half. The 2 exceptions to this rule that we'll get into in a little bit more detail here in a moment are going to be the solar resources I mentioned earlier to Peter, as well as the non-generating resources. Peter, you've got that. I've got a question looking at.
Yeah, I just want clarification in terms of eligibility, in terms of calculating EFC. If I'm a CT that's got a noise restriction, I'm then conditionally available. I would not then be able to. What would be my EFCs?
0.
Say if I was across the board.
Yes.
So I wouldn't be eligible to provide flexibility if I've got any sort of a conditionally available resource.
That's correct. That was the eligibility.
Well, I was confused because that's the eligibility for
getting an EFC.
Well, no. The way I understood it, and you're answering my question. So the way I understood it was eligible for basically for the ramping. It would not be eligible for the ramping, but it might be eligible for the shorter.
No, because remember the minimum criteria was you have to meet the eligibility for the ramping to be eligible for the uncertainty.
So you're basically cutting out a lot of resources that currently have EFCs that will just not be counting for flexibility.
Yes.
Even though they are providing the flexibility to the market and
we
the ISO relies on such flexibility.
Well, we rely on market dispatches, yes. I mean, as far as in how they perform and are participating on a day-to-day basis is one thing. We understand that there may be some differences. And I think, the argument that comes back is, hold on one moment, please, is making sure that the resource that is there is the conditional eligibility one that would impede the ISO's ability to access that capacity at a time of need. And, that's, I think, part of where...
Well, but the need is a 24/7 need, as I understand it. I mean, it's not, you're saying at any time.
The offer obligations are going to be a bit different than what we put forward. We're not looking at a 24/7 economic bidding obligation. So there's questions that will come into play for that because, again, we tried to focus flexibility on the intervals where we saw the greatest need, but not to say the only need.
Has the ISO done a calculation of how many resources under these new definitions would become ineligible or what the new EFC would be?
No, just as the statement I made earlier this morning with Brian, until we have an opportunity to kind of get a sense from folks, because again, the question of whether the principle is good is irrelevant of the number, isn't it? The principle is good if the number is...
Well, no, not if you have a disconnect between the amount, how you're determining what the requirement is, and what supply you have available to meet the need. So, because essentially what you would be saying, you understand what I'm saying.
I understand what you're saying, but again, okay. If we identify a deficiency, that's fine. Identifying a deficiency that we need more of some type of capacity, we should try and do that. It's simply to say, well, we don't have enough to meet this need, so put these back into the pool so that number is bigger than that number.
Well, I guess the question is if the question I have is you would be confident that you could operate the system with the existing set of resources given the way you're setting the requirements and the way you're counting, because I'm concerned that what you're doing basically is saying I'm going to set the requirements over here based on something. I'm then going to look at sort of what can meet those requirements in the way I think they should be met, but you're not looking to see whether or not there's feasibility there.
Okay.
And so you would immediately be going from, okay, I can operate the system to, no, I can't operate the system, and because it's not meeting my requirements. So I'm just concerned about what the feasibility is, and that's why I'm asking sort of, what are the EFCs that are counting, and what are the requirements that you'll be proposing here?
Okay, thank you. Grant, I saw your hand up back there. You sure? Okay. All right. All right, so I'm going to move on then to talk a little bit more about our thoughts on solar resources and the NGRs, which would be the exceptions to the UCAP provision. Solar resources, we talked about this morning, their ability to produce high levels is part of what is creating net load. So the more solar you get, the lower the net load goes, the higher the ramp becomes. But that's not to say that those resources can't help meet that ramp. However, when you get into the NQC value that is being arrived at from the LCC studies currently underway, what we find is that the primary driver of loss of load expectations in those studies is peak intervals are actually slightly after peak intervals when the sun is gone. And so the NQC value that's coming out, or the ELCC value that's coming out of those studies is quite low. Well, from a flexibility and net load standpoint, the inverse is actually true. Their ability to offset and avoid steep net load ramps comes from their willingness and ability to submit economic bids and take a dispatch lower than their full forecasted output. So, and we see that this is much closer to nameplate in the middle of the day when the net load ramp starts. So trying to cap them at cap the EFC for solar resources at the NQC or UCAP didn't make sense. It left a lot of flexibility on the table. So what we're proposing to do instead of having that cap is to allow for solar resources to count for EFC as a function of the resource's historic output. And again, we're going to have to assess whether that's historic actual output or the bid-in capability or forecasted capability, simply because, again, the more they produce, if they accept a willingness to back that off, that's the curtailment. That's how they meet and minimize. Yes, Peter. Okay. Just how they meet that net load ramp is by putting in that bid and saying I'm willing to back down and take that ISO dispatch. So again, it also recognizes that solar production or lack thereof is a large contributor to the net load ramp. So if the clouds are there, we don't have a big net load ramp. If the clouds are not there, we do, and they have an ability to have a very significant impact on that net load ramp during those intervals. So we think that as a starting point, the EFC value for solar resources should be a relatively high percentage of their historic output. We've thrown around a bunch of numbers but did not land on one. So we'll be seeking stakeholder feedback on, A, whether it makes sense to take this route. Again, I think it works because we are building back in the curtailments. And then if so, what the percentages would look like. Peter?
Yeah, Peter Griffiths, PG&E. I guess the question I have on this is that you can make the same argument about solar production meeting the peak load, couldn't you?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
Well, but basically when the peak happens, when the peak load happens, essentially the output of the solar resource is not limited by what its ELCC value is. But that's what you're basing the NQC on. And so I guess I'm confused about the inconsistency between using an exceedance type of methodology for EFC, like I think you're proposing here, and essentially continuing to use an ELCC methodology for the ability of the resource to be able to meet the peak.
I think what you're driving at there, Peter, is a much deeper conversation, even philosophically, about, what is ELCC, what does it mean, and I'm not sure that we're prepared to open up that Pandora's box as part of this.
Well, but to some degree, you see the inconsistency that you're introducing here by, and I'm not saying that that's the wrong thing to do. I'm just saying that, we need, if we're thinking about having consistency across the program, we need to be thinking about these types of things.
Okay, thank you.
Vic? Vic Kruger, San Diego Gas Metric. Is there a threshold for this? And a lot of contracts have a limitation on the number of curtailment hours for solar and such, and some have none, so I assume they won't be eligible, the ones that can't be curtailed. But if you have a limitation on the number of hours, like reduced limitation, is there going to be some threshold number?
I think that's a procurement decision about whether the resource would be able to submit the bids and be able to meet that requirement. I don't think we've fully kind of fleshed out the idea of how those limited provisions would be accounted for. Again, if 5% of hours, then maybe you want to keep that in mind. It's how much flex RA the resource provides. So you don't have to provide the full output. You can say, well, I've got 5% of my hours. I'm going to produce some small portion of that I think at the end of the day, if they get curtailed, will be 5% of the hours. Now you got a question. Okay, Grant.
Yeah, Grant McDaniel with Wellhead. I'm just going to go way back here for a minute to the portfolio analysis and trying to see how the EFC on solar is going to work when I'm looking at a 24-hour basis for the portfolio analysis, right?
Yes.
And so if you had a lot of your flexibility coming from solar, you might fail that test. Would that be true?
If I have a lot of what?
A lot of your flexibility, flex RA coming from solar.
So again, when we have resources, sorry, I lost what I touched. It didn't do anything when I did that. Well, but you don't have to sit down. Sorry, I'm having technical difficulties apparently.
The portfolio analysis does consider both AS and imbalance reserves, right?
So we had the portfolio analysis did not currently propose imbalance reserves as a part of it, as part of what we would be assessing in that space. I got to think through whether or not we could. I'm not seeing any major obstacles that would prevent us from doing so. But if you're getting the flexibility from solar, again, this is part of the challenge I noted a little bit earlier, which is to say, and we'll get into this in just a moment, which is the windows of assessment and offer obligations are really focused on the daytime issues. It's not to say that we don't need capabilities in the evening. It's whether or not we think that those are the numbers we've seen initially are not as big overnight, simply because we don't have as much load, so that variability shrinks, and we don't have as many variable resources. So again, it shrinks a little bit more. But yes, are we going to have flexibility at night? We're not as concerned about that, especially even in the portfolio analysis as well. Okay, Eric.
Eric from Edison. So I'm kind of concerned that we've spent a great number of pages previous to this talking about, I believe, I'm going to characterize it this way, tell me if I'm wrong, it's either always flexible or it's not. So we take things like cars and say, if it can't be flexible all the time, I'm not interested in it. Yet here we are taking a resource that is not going to be flexible all the time and making some sort of an exception for it. So I'm confused as to why we're making an exception for this, and we're not trying to figure out how things like conditionally available resources can provide flexibility at points in time, but can't at others.
Okay, thank you. And to the extent that folks want to offer us solutions for the car problem, we remain open to them. So if there's something... Cool, okay. Thank you. You're not talking into your microphone. Okay. Don't worry, it was only Eric. So let's move on. Unless there are any questions on the phone? Pausing, questions, phone?
Lauren, do we have anybody in the queue?
Hey, Carl, this is Matt Barmack again. I had a question way back on slide 117. I honestly, maybe this is, I apologize, maybe this is explained better in the paper, but I really don't understand how you're proposing to determine EFCs for thermal units. So will everything be from, like, with respect to the sub-bullet right in the middle of the page, will everything be from a cold start? So nothing that has a cold start longer than 3 hours will have any EFC?
No, that's not the way it'll work out, Matt. We'll look at the longest 3 hour. We'll look at the furthest resource can travel over a 3 hour interval. In that instance, just by the math of it, that resource's P-min would not count. We'd only be able to count its value above P-min. Okay, so first, I mean, sort of algorithmically, first you'll look at starting cold and see how far the unit can get, but if it turns out that it can go farther from its P-min than it could from a cold start, you'll use the value from P-min or whatever portion of its range is it can move the most over for 3 hours, something like that. Yes.
And so that will
and 1 hour.
That will reflect things like ramp rates and transition times. You're just not going to use the weighted average ramp rate directly.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Cool. Jamie, you had a question?
Yeah, Jamie, CPUC. In your next iteration, are you guys planning on doing a calculation of the current fleet and the EFC values to have an idea of the magnitude that these changes would have on the Flex product in the market?
We're going to do our best. Right now, we're a little short-staffed on some of the data from our data folks, but again, we understand the need to get something like that out. So it's in the queue.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, one more on the phone. And then, again, I'd just like to move on so that we can make sure we have ample time to cover things I was hoping to be done by now. But that's cool.
Lauren, do we have another person in the queue?
Yeah, hi, this is Paul with Klika. So I guess the first follow-up to my comment before lunch, is this what you meant by addressing the concern I had earlier about the
solar
constitution? The solar?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I'm still not that sure this addresses my concern.
Okay, then let's talk for a moment. So again, the whole point here, and I'll try and bring this back together for a moment, Paul, and then you can tell me if I've hit it yet. Right now, again, there's a disconnect in how solar can provide flexibility in meeting those net load ramps and how it's counted. And what our goal here is to say, right now, at some level, the curtailments that we're getting are providing flexible capacity, but we're not counting them. And at some level, that's okay because we're also not including them in our need. And so what this is really an opportunity to do is say, we're going to calculate the correct need, and then we're going to allow the resources to correctly count towards meeting that need, which is to say, yes, the need will be greater, but your flex RA from solar will then clearly be counting towards that need. And on top of that, we'll not be counting and limiting it to the NQC, but we'll be allowing it to count for up to its output that's in part driving the need.
Okay. I'll have to think about that some more.
I'm happy to talk with you offline, Paul, if it would help.
And then the other issue, you said that solar is an exception, but if wind had a daytime profile, would that also provide flexibility?
Wind was a much harder nut to crack on this one, quite frankly, because it's just it's a harder nut to crack, which is to say it doesn't necessarily have the same consistent profile that we saw in solar. And so I'm open to ideas on it, quite frankly, but I don't think there's quite the disconnect between the ELCC value of the wind and I think its necessary ability to provide flexible RA. Again, I'm open to thoughts on that, Paul, but that nut was a little tougher to crack.
It seems like to me if wind at times could have this value, then being sure that it could get credited to the value then would be a benefit, because then you get more diversity of resources. No, it is
like I said, Paul.
Crack. Yeah.
Yeah, if you've got ideas, I'm all ears, man. So again, I'm going to state at this moment my goal, just to facilitate the discussions for Lauren and Gabe this afternoon, is I'd like to wrap this section up by no later than 2 p.m. So I'm going to start moving forward on this. Again, not with the goal of skipping and avoiding questions, but just making sure that we have an opportunity to at least scratch the surface on all the topics we've proposed here. NGR resources. I'll keep this brief. We're basically going to contemplate NGR resources comparably to how we do today, which is to say they allow for their full charge and discharge capabilities, and we'll be looking at that over the time horizons that we're looking for the discharge capabilities. So 3 hour, 1 hour, and 15 minutes, what they can do during those intervals. One of the questions that has come up is a question about can I be an EFC-only resource, or do I need to have a NQC or a UCAP value to count as flexible RA? We're still in the study process mode on that. That's happening with our infrastructure planning team in some of the transmission planning works to see what deliverability means and how resources can they be EFC-only and still providing benefits. So again, we're still in the works on that, but as of right now, the status quo is that the resources would be required to have an NQC or UCAP until further notice. And so again, don't get on me until we got that one fully resolved. So we are opening the door for imports. This has been a bugaboo for at least one market participant I can think of has been knocking on our door for some time to provide this, and actually many. Our goal was to try and, again, have these resources that we realize are providing flexibility to and ramping needs, especially for the forecastable products, to do so. We are looking for them to maintain many of the same standards that Chris talked about this morning for the system RA capacity, including the standard for firm energy, as well as having MIC allocations to make sure we can shift the capacity and the associated flexibility into the ISO. We do note that they have to note the BAA of origin. We had that discussion already today. I don't care to revisit it at this moment. Import resources, again, just like the internal resources, we're looking at them being 15-minute dispatchable as opposed to the hourly blocks. And then, again, making the limitation right now because of some of the uncertainty rules that the imports would not be eligible to provide some of the the uncertainty, to meet the uncertainty requirements. So Jamie had a question in the back of the room, so I'm going to
just a clarifying question, Jamie's PUC. So they have to demonstrate that they have MIC in order to bring the flexible capacity in and count it for RA. I know that the CPUC does still bundle flex and system, but Kai says it's unbundled, and I'm wondering how that would interact with MIC.
If they're using it for both, that's great. If they're using it for one and not the other, it's still being used.
So they could bundle it and use it for both.
They wouldn't have to count it twice. They would only count once in that instance.
Okay.
But if they use it for only flex, then it's still MIC used.
Eric from Edison. So, sorry, I'm confused. How is a firm energy import flexible? I'm bringing it in at a price guaranteed it's going to deliver energy to me. That's the standard right now for bringing in an RA import. So if it is a firm energy import and I am going to get that energy in all of the hours that have been defined, how is it flexible?
All right. Hey, fair point, fair question, and I think this is where we get to, we're talking about what does firm energy mean, and we're looking at really the transmission aspect of this. That it's still economically bid energy. It's not self-scheduled energy, but it's firm and deliverable to the ISO based on the transmission rights. But we can clarify exactly what that means. I think that's a good point of clarification, Eric. I apologize. Thank you.
Thanks.
Some of the challenges we have with imports and EFC is that they don't have the same defined ramp rates or minimum operating levels that we have for internal resources, no PMINs, for example. So that means the calculation of the EFCs is a bit, well, not possible. So what we're looking at here is resource IDs have an EFC value associated with them up to the value of the import resource that is supporting it. And so the LSC and the resource owners are going to have to determine how much flexible RA they want to procure from that import resource. We're not going to put, or we're not able to put some of the same resource-specific ramp rates and constraints on it we do for calculating other EFC values. So now we're going to move into the demonstrations and Flex RA showing component of the program. And basically, we're getting to not a lot of changes from the standard operating procedures for today, which is to say each LRA will get its proportionate share. They can do their allocation to their LSEs as they see fit. As long as we get those allocations from the LRA plugged into our SEER system, we can basically handle whatever allocation they choose to dole that out. If they don't provide one, we will provide one for them. MSS load following will not get allocations for load variability. They have requirements to follow load. This is, again, consistent with current tariff provisions. So, again, there's nothing new in what we're asking for in terms of the demonstrations at this point. Determining the allocable share to each LRA, we're going to continue to do as we do today, which is for the forecasted proportions. We'll look at the 5 largest 3-hour and 1-hour ramps and make the determinations based on the contributions of those ramps to each LRA. We are going to make a few minor changes which are designed to really align the drivers of flexible needs, particularly in those forecasted areas, which is to say, right now there is, and I don't exactly remember why we did this, but we did it. The load values come from different hours than the wind and solar values, and so we're going to swap that and make sure they align, because it was yielding some pretty bizarre results where we had high percentage changes on low load shifts were creating very strange allocations. We worked through most of that, and we have methodologies to deal with that today, but again, we think we can improve on that. But again, using the same 5 large ramps that we use today. For the uncertainty requirements, this one's a little bit less complete at this point in time. We're trying to work through what a reasonable allocation of these requirements would be. That's on the wrong page. Sorry. So with the uncertainty allocations, where did that go? No, that's not. Yeah, I've got a disconnect between my 2 slide decks here for some reason. All right, so this is where I need to be. All right, so the ISO is still looking at how to do the allocations for the uncertainty portions. Right now, we're at a starting point of considering the allocations again to the LRA based on their peak load share and their percentage of wind and solar. We understand that this isn't a perfect allocation methodology, but it reflects some of the major drivers of uncertainty, though not the only drivers. Again, we understand that. We're looking for additional stakeholder input as to what an appropriate method for allocating that uncertainty need would be if this is not an appropriate method. So we will be looking for 100% of the flexible RA showings in the year ahead and month ahead. And then we'll assess the showings for each requirement independently, as I noted earlier, which is to say that I can have a resource on the long ramping and not the fast ramping or the uncertainty. I can actually have a resource on the uncertainty and not the other 2. Or I can have it on all 3. So again, the ISO will look at those all independently, and there doesn't need to have the same resources on all the showings. So it's not if you're providing the long or the uncertainty that it automatically counts towards the base ramping. There's not that cascading type design. We're going to look at these each individually.
Eric from Edison, just curious, why on a share of peak load? What's the basis for peak load? If I had a peak load that never changed, it doesn't contribute to the ramping need at all, right?
This is the uncertainty element of it. So
yeah, I understand, but it's the uncertainty of the amount of change in load, not the peak itself, right?
Fair point. Like I said, put it in comments.
Okay, I'm just curious as to what the reasoning was, that's all. I'm not objecting to it, I just want to understand it.
The honest reason, Eric, is on this one we struggled a bit more to come up to pin down such a clearly defined allocation methodology, so we wanted a starting point. This provided us with that.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I think I'm back on track now. So just about done. So once we receive the showings, we'll go through our standard process, which is to say we'll notify all the LSEs if they've provided sufficient flexibility in each of the categories. And then if there's a deficiency, we'll notify them. They'll have the same cure periods. Gabe's going to get into a bit more of the details on once the showings come in process about what the cure periods and notifications mean as far as backstop procurement goes. We'll look for the showings to be submitted to the ISO in terms of EFC. So again, what we've got is we've got the system and local showings coming in terms of NQC as it has in the past. We've got the flexible coming in terms of EFC as it has in the past. So hopefully we still have 3 requirements as we have in the past. you can see a trend here. We're trying to keep a lot of the administrative aspects of this, don't do that, consistent with what we've done historically. So as I noted earlier, we've had a lot of questions and confusion about what the offer obligations are for the various products that we have in place today. We are looking to simplify the must-offer obligations. We are looking at a single offer obligation from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. It aligns with what we've proposed for the UCAP hours for assessment of forced outages. So again, we have that alignment. We again note that it doesn't cover all hours of need. It doesn't cover all the variants of need. Some have argued that the offer obligation extends for particularly the 3-hour and 1-hour products way beyond what it needs to. Again, these are submitted bid and the ISO will optimally dispatch them. It's not, I think, such an earth-shattering development to say, submit that bid. But we didn't want to have a plethora of offer obligations to increase the confusion. So that will be to submit economic bids into the ISO market from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. With the idea that we are trying to strike a balance, and we understand that some people will say that the offer obligation is too wide, but we've also argued that it's at least simple. For wind and solar resources, they should submit economic bids for the minimum of their forecast or their shown EFC. So to the extent that they're coming online and their forecasted output is lower than their EFC value, they should be at least showing the forecasted output as something that is flexible to the extent that they've shown it as such. But we understand that there are times where that will be lower than their shown EFC value, particularly for solar, given the values that we've allowed them to account for. NGR resources will also have to submit bids that cover not only the charge portion of the resource, but also the discharge, so that, again, if we're measuring them over that full range, we have access to that full range. So it's not just, hey, give us a discharge bid, and that's good enough. We want to make sure that we've got the full range of those resources. So it is 2 o'clock. I'm going to obviously pause now because I'm done, but that doesn't mean I get to step away from the podium. I want to take one last opportunity for questions. I'm happy to talk to folks offline because I understand, again, we've kind of rushed through the end of this, but I do want to take a moment to see if there are thoughts, comments, questions, concerns, or rotten fruit to be thrown. Seeing no fruit being hurled at me, I'm going to, oh, there we go. Mark?
Carl, just one more comment on the processing all of this. It sounds like your deficiency analysis would be done after the showings along with the UCAP and along with local capacity requirements? Yes,
we're trying to align that so that we're not running 16 different assessments.
All of those are going to be done concurrently just shortly after T-45?
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
We have a question on the phone. Go ahead, caller.
Hey, Carl, this is Sandeep with Alice Power. Just a quick question. It's back on your slide 119, where you were talking about the EFC deliverability studies. CAISO is exploring that as part of transmission planning process. I just wanted to find out, is there a stakeholder process that's currently open for this that we can participate and provide comments on?
I have to double check where exactly Neil and Robert are running that, and I can get back to you on that, Sandeep.
Okay, thank you.
All right. And with no further delay, Lauren? Thank you.
Okay. Hi again, everybody. I am going to get into 2 of the topics that we have in the local RA piece of this proposal. The first one will be our local capacity studies with availability limited resources, and the second will be the slow DR topic. As you guys will see in the slides that we have coming up, a lot of these have been presented before, just some differences in examples and such. these pieces are a little bit more finalized than other parts of the proposal, so I just wanted to throw that out there to people that this is a little bit of a review, and we may not be going into as much detail into both of these items in future presentations because they haven't changed that much throughout the course of this process so far. And of course, we will bring it back if there are other changes that we make in the future, but just as a heads up. So to start with the local capacity technical studies, currently the RA program doesn't fully consider resources availability limitations in the local RA space. Availability limited resources have energy limitations that could affect their ability to respond to contingency events in local areas. And as we've talked about in previous sections of the proposal, the RA requirements are currently based on meeting peak capacity needs rather than energy needs in all hours. The CAISO has proposed an availability limited resource definition, and that definition is resources with significant dispatch limitations, such as limited duration hours or event calls that would limit the resource's ability to respond to a contingency event in a local area. We've limited the definition to include resources that count towards meeting local area or sub-area needs, and recently this definition was recognized by the CPUC in its RA decision, and we do greatly appreciate the recognition of this term and look forward to further consideration and coordination on this issue. The CAISO believes it is important to consider availability limitations in local capacity areas. Currently, in order to qualify as an RA resource, a resource must have a minimum of 4 hours of duration. And in our Moore Park study that the CAISO transmission planning team performed, we found that the minimum duration requirement may lead to procurement that is sufficient in meeting our peak RA requirements, but may not be sufficient in meeting energy needs in all hours of the day or month. So starting this year, the CAISO has published hourly load shapes and available resource data to inform procurement that is aligned with these energy needs in local capacity areas and sub-areas. So this slide shows an example of the hourly load profiles that we've started publishing in our local capacity technical studies this year. In our last stakeholder meeting, we had Catalin from transmission planning come up and go into a little bit more detail about how, about the methodology behind these graphs, but I wanted to show them again just as an example of what's new in our local capacity technical studies. So the graph on the left shows a load shape over the course of a day and the N-1-1 transfer capability, which is the red horizontal line. And load above that line would need to be served by resources within a local capacity area. And then the graph on the right shows a yearly profile. And then on the bottom is the amount of resources in the local area. So that's what we're publishing in our local capacity technical studies. This is one sub-area, and then I also have another sub-area that shows a little bit longer of duration need within the local area.
Just a clarifying question, Christopher McLean, California Energy Commission staff. Could you remind the group whether or not the detailed data for, I guess, behind both of those plots was made available in the local capacity study process?
Catalin, do you want to answer that one?
Hi, this is Catalin with the ISO. The detailed data behind those have not been published. The graphs have been published.
Thanks. So the CAISO plans to maintain the existing local capacity technical study process with the certain additions that we've shown in the previous slides to inform availability needs in local areas. So Starting this year, we've incorporated the hourly load shapes into the LCT study process to inform of availability needs in the local areas, both of the quantity of capacity in megawatts and the energy in megawatt hours needed in the local area. And we also believe this will inform longer-term procurement decisions by providing greater transparency into our duration needs multiple years in advance. The CAISO is also planning on validating that the RA resources that we receive in the showings meet energy needs under the hourly load shape curve. And Gabe will talk a little bit more about in the CPM section of how that will work. So that is all I have on the local capacity technical study process. I'll go ahead and pause again for questions before we go into the slow DR piece. Go ahead in the back.
Mark, go ahead and then.
Dick Kruger, San Diego Gas and Electric. Could you tell us how long it might take if we decide later on in the process to switch from NQC to a UCAP for local studies, how long that might take and the problems involved with that so we can evaluate the benefits versus the costs and the timing?
Yeah, so currently we have proposed to use the UCAP for system and NQC for local. I think after some of the conversations that we've had today and yesterday, we're going to take another look at what it would take to do a UCAP for local. I can't really get into the specifics of how long that transition will take. I don't know if any of the others up here have anything. Catalin, if you have anything you want to add.
This is Catalin. One methodology versus the other. Once we have the numbers, we can transition to the other methodology. We can have some more discussions later, if that's appropriate or not.
Yeah, this is Carl. If we determine it works, that we can express them, the local requirements in terms of UCAP in a meaningful and procurable manner, I'm sure Catalan will figure out how to make it work within about 2 to 3 days.
And then, Mark, did you have anything? Same question? Okay. Did we have anything on the phone, Christina?
Christian, do we have anybody in the queue?
At this time, there are no questions in the queue.
Okay. So I'll go ahead and move on to the slow DR topic. This is somewhat related, but a separate issue regarding local RA. Slow DR is an availability limited resource that cannot respond to CAISO dispatches within 20 minutes. Per NERC standards and the CAISO tariff, we must be able to secure the system within 30 minutes of a contingency occurring. This will allow roughly 10 minutes for our operators to assess the system conditions and 20 minutes for a resource to respond to a dispatch. This required response time impacts demand response resources that are slower because they cannot respond within a 20-minute notification, and they also have availability limitations that would prevent frequent dispatch in order to pre-position the system. So to meet local RA needs, the CAISO has said resources must either be capable of responding quickly enough such that the CAISO can rebalance the system within 30 minutes of a contingency event, or have sufficient availability such that the resource can be dispatched frequently on a pre-contingency basis as a preventative measure before a contingency occurs. Eric, go ahead.
Eric from Edison, how are you defining frequently?
Well, we've done planning studies on slow demand response in particular to see if it has sufficient availability to be dispatched on a pre-contingency basis. I don't have a specific number as to how frequently it would be, but based on the number of event calls that the resources currently have defined, our planning studies have indicated that they could be dispatched on a pre-contingency basis.
Yeah, I'd be interested in the number that the ISO would find acceptable so that the folks who are providing DR can contemplate changes to their programs to meet that number if that's what's needed.
Okay, I think I'll get into that a little bit more also later in the presentation, but yeah. Vic, go ahead.
Vic Kruger, San Diego Gas Electric. Your two example graphs might give us a pretty good indication where they have the frequency chart in the upper right. One of them has very few excursions and is only needed a few times, where the other one has significant number, and that might form a basis, a rough basis for eligibility.
Yeah, and that's right. I'll get into that a little bit more, but we do suggest that people take a look at those graphs if they want to figure out or anticipate how often they could be dispatched. Thanks. So as a result of this effort, the CAISO is committed to developing tools that could be used to dispatch FlowDR on a pre-contingency basis so that it can meet our local reliability needs. FlowDR resources would be dispatched before a potential contingency occurs as a preventative measure. And once we do that, we receive some questions of whether or not it would be canceled if a contingency doesn't occur. But if we do dispatch FlowDR on a pre-contingency basis, it would not be canceled if the contingency doesn't occur. This is because it's done as a preventative measure. It could be that dispatching this FlowDR actually helped us avoid a contingency, and we don't have perfect foresight into when and where a contingency will occur. The CAISO has also stated that pre-contingency dispatch will result in more frequent dispatch of FlowDR than it has originally experienced in the past. This is because if we're relying on it as a local resource, it could be needed more often if other local capacity resources go on outage or retire. So we've gotten a lot of questions on that, but we do think that dispatching FlowDR on a pre-contingency basis will result in more frequent dispatch of FlowDR. And on the next few slides, I have illustrative examples as to why, if we're depending on these as local capacity resources, they may be needed more frequently as the system conditions change and such. So I'll go through those just to illustrate what we mean here. Eric, go ahead.
Eric from Edison, one more question. What does the ISO need to demonstrate that a demand response resource is capable of responding within 20 minutes?
This would be if it's able to, I don't know, John, do you have something?
This is John Goodman with the ISO, that it could receive an ADS dispatch and be at its full RA quantity within that 20 minutes.
Okay. As a design, as test, as what? What's the criteria to evaluate that it does that?
Right now, it depends on if you're a IOU program or DRAM, or the ISO can obviously, we have the authority to test the resource per our tariff. We can also rely on an actual dispatch event to see, to look back at that event to see if they actually delivered. So there's sort of different ways to actually get to that number, but the bottom line is you can always test. We can always test the resource to see if it can actually deliver in that time.
Okay, and since no resource is perfect, including a thermal resource, what happens if it gets 99.9% of the way there? Is it disqualified completely? Is there some?
It's not. It's reported to the local regulatory authority, the PUC.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thanks. Oh, okay, we'll go to the phone.
Christian, we'll go to the question on the phone, please.
This is Paul Nelson with CLECA. Kind of follow up with Eric. I'm a bit disappointed that you're not reflecting to what can be achieved after a notification within 20 minutes, and you're still looking at it has to go up to the full amount. This has been an issue we've stated, on a number of occasions, so I won't go into any more detail on that. I did want to back up. That chart that had the energy, it had an annual one on the right and the peak on the left. Is that, the one on the left, is that a subset of zeroing in on a peak area on the one on the right on the annual? I'm trying to interpret those two charts.
Yeah, so the one on the left shows the load shape over the course of a day, and then the one on the right shows over the course of a year. Does that answer your question?
Well, I know, because there was a part on the annual one where it seems to go like above for a day, and I was wondering if that was representative of one of those cases at a particular time on the annual chart, and is that how to correctly interpret that data?
Sorry, I'm not really understanding the question. Catalin, do you want to respond to that?
This is Catalin. I think he's referring to the other graph. Were you referring to the other graph, not the one that's up right now? This one, or referring to this graph? Okay, so you can see that, for example, this particular area or sub-area only has maybe 2 or 3 days that is above the emergency rating for that line, and on the peak day, you have the graph on the left.
Okay. All right.
Which is one of the days, the highest day on the right.
Okay. Okay. All right. So I did interpret it correctly. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. Okay, so getting back to where we were before, I'm going to go over an example just to illustrate how if slow DR is used as local capacity, it could be dispatched more frequently than it's experienced in the past. So I have an example of a local capacity area on non-peak days. The load's 20 megawatts. We have one peak with load of 28 megawatts and one peak with load of 30 megawatts. And we have 4 resources within the local area, resource A, B, C, and D. And resource D is a slow DR resource with an availability limitation of 3 consecutive days. So if we have all 4 resources available to us, we will need to use resource A and B on the non-peak days, resource A, B, and C on our first peak of 28 megawatts, and all 4 resources on our second peak of 30 megawatts. But if we were to only have 3 resources available to us, we have the same peak, and resource D has either retired or gone on outage and is not available to us, we would need to rely on the slow response DR resource for both of our peaks. So really this example was just to illustrate that if we're relying on slow DR as a local capacity resource, it may be required to respond to events more frequently. And this has been a concern that's been brought up by resources before, but we just want to explain the construct of local RA and how it could be relied on more frequently if it is a local resource. Dick?
Dick Kruger, San Diego Gas and Electric. I have a little concern in that, especially if we go to UCAP, but even without going to UCAP, you know, the planning standards might be N-1 minus 1, and when we enter into this area, you're sort of doing a G1, N-1, N-1, and are we going to a higher level? I understand there'll be more dispatches just because you don't know what the load is going to be and it may not happen. So if you expected 3 loads to be above a certain level, you don't know which 3 days that might be. It might be dispatched 5 times. But I want to not mislead that it's going to be a significant difference in this case.
Okay. John, you have a response?
John Gooden with the ISO. Vic, maybe if I'm understanding you correctly, maybe we're looking at the example differently, but I think what Lauren's trying to highlight is that under today's RA construct, the DR again, serves as capacity, and it has the ability to actually avoid or defer generating resources. And so if one of these resources is no longer in the money, is not getting RA contracts, retires, we now have this DR resource that we're more dependent on because that generator went away. And so this is what can be the outcome is, again, you retire these resources that aren't availability limited and displace them with availability limited, that you can get into these kind of situations where naturally you're going to have to depend on that resource for more megawatt hours than what you would have otherwise.
Thanks. Yeah, so that was what we were trying to illustrate in this example. It's just that local resources may be relied upon more frequently given what we have in the local area going forward. So going back to requests that we've received with regards to how often they will be called upon as a local resource, we've been asked to give some estimates on how often, but we've looked into that and we can't provide anything concrete that we would be comfortable giving out to participants. So local resources that wish to infer on potential number of calls can use our hourly load shapes that we've gone over in the previous graphs, like we mentioned before. So the local studies assume 100% availability of all resources and transmission other than the limiting contingency. That's what's demonstrated in the graphics. And the local studies publish daily and yearly load profiles, as we've seen, as well as the LDR requirement and the amount of physical resources in the local area. And we can't provide any specific estimates on how often flow DR would be dispatched due to many factors that are difficult for us to determine. So now we're going to get into the tools that we've been looking into to actually dispatch these resources on a pre-contingency basis. We have two approaches that we've developed. The first would be a post-day-ahead approach, where in the day-ahead market it would be exactly the same as it is today, no change. We would continue to run our minimum online commitment constraints that would commit resources as needed, as identified, mock commits long start resources, and the requirement would be load in the local area minus the import capability into that local area minus the short start capacity that we have available that could be committed in real time. That doesn't need to be committed day ahead. After the day ahead market runs, if we see that the mock is not sufficient to commit enough resources to meet our local need, then we would dispatch the slow DR. So this would be a dispatch that's provided in the day ahead that the real time wouldn't undo or modify. And the post day ahead ED would dispatch flow DR, and it would dispatch enough to cover the mock insufficiency. So in this proposal, the response time for slow DR would align with the day-ahead market timing. So the day-ahead market usually closes around 1 p.m., and then we would run the post-day-ahead process or assessment, and then we would dispatch slow DR at that time. So that is our post-day-ahead approach. The CAISO also has some enhancements being made to the PDR model that could also be used to dispatch slow DR on a real-time basis, so not in the post-day-ahead, but actually the day of. So in ESDR 3, we proposed, and this has already, ESDR 3 has gone through and been board approved, but we proposed hourly block and 15-minute block bidding options, and this would give slow DR extended notice rather than if they're dispatched on a 5-minute basis. In the hourly block, they would get 52.5 minutes of notice. and for 15-minute blocks, they would get 22.5 minutes of advance notice. We could also transition our post-day-ahead tool that I talked about on the previous slide into the real-time market time horizon to provide dispatches within these time horizons. The CAISO also has a policy called Contingency Modeling Enhancements that's been board approved. That is another mechanism that could be used to dispatch slow DR when it's economic over reserving corrective capacity over another resource. We're still assessing this policy to see if it can be applied for our needs with local RA, but it is something else that the CAISO has in the works that could dispatch slow DR. Jamie, go ahead.
Jamie, PUC. Could you walk me through a little bit how this would work in terms of the current DR programs that receive credits in the year ahead space, and how this proposal would flow into that crediting?
I think it would work for resources that receive credits and also that are on the supply plan. I'm not sure why it would be, or if there would be any differences.
So like in the year ahead, so the way it works now is we get the load impacts in April, there's some vetting that goes on, and then those, both supply and demand side resources flow into the annual allocations and essentially offset the amount of local procurement that has to be done by LSEs because they're getting a local credit for that DR. Mm-hmm. So how would this proposal in essentially limiting slow response DR flow into that? Would the utilities notify us in April that this amount of DR is slow response?
That's strong. I think we would have to have that kind of process, Jamie, to be able to identify those utility or IOU DR resources, PDR resources that are slow responding DR that count for local, so that, again, we can do the right accounting and crediting. My petition is the commission stop crediting and put these all on supply plans, but that would make this much easier.
But John, even if they're on supply plans, we're still treating the DRAM resources like CAM, so we still have to have the allocation, the amount that they're going to count for, and then we just send out that allocation ahead of time. Because they're going to centralize.
Well, good point. So we would just have to have an accounting ahead of time as to which resources fall into this category that are slow response but count as local RA capacity. So that's something we'd have to, again, work with the commission to ensure that this process is fully fleshed out on both sides. So we are considering, as part of this whole policy, that obviously there's a whole level of collaboration that has to happen with the commission to make this happen. So.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, so I guess this proposal is focusing more on the operations piece, how do we actually use them, but there is additional work and collaboration that needs to be done to figure out process and things like that. Mark?
Thanks, Lauren. It's Mark Smith, Calpine. I'm sorry, I'm confused as to what the proposal is here. It sounds like if slow DR submits or is allocated and counted for local capacity, it could be subject to pre-dispatch, pre-contingency dispatch. It could be exceptionally dispatched after mock. And it could be dispatched as part of CME. So all three of those are possible if, in fact, slow DR is a local resource. Is that where I got it? Is that right?
Somewhat. So the whole concept of pre-dispatch is we have different tools that we could use to do that. So after the mock runs, the ED, that is one way of doing it, or the real-time approaches that I have laid out on this slide. So both of those options are ways to facilitate the pre-contingency dispatch.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
That's helpful. Thanks.
I think we have a question on the phone, so we'll go to that.
Yeah, we have two.
Okay.
Hi, this is Jennifer Chamberlain with Sea Power, and I think you answered my question 1 second ago for Mark Smith, which is we have been talking about this kind of ESDA 3 intertype bidding option as a mechanism to let slower DR participate in the real time instead of pre-dispatch. Are you going to let different resources, is Kaiser going to make a choice and say either resources are going to be pre-dispatched day ahead, or they're going to be eligible to use this as their 3, or will there be a choice that resources that are local can make for participation in your proposal?
Yeah, so I think our ultimate goal is to have resources be dispatched in the real-time market time horizon, so in the hourly block or a 15-minute block. And we would still consider this to be a pre-contingency dispatch because it would have to happen before potential contingency occurs in order to ensure we meet our time requirements. So a resource that could be dispatched with 52 and a half minutes notice would still need to be dispatched ahead of time in order to ensure we meet those time requirements. But our intent is to have resources. Go ahead.
So, but that would be economically dispatched in the kind of the 52.5-minute time period, which ideally you would have a better idea if you're close to a contingency at 52 minutes than it's the day ahead. Am I thinking about that?
Yeah,
right?
And that is the reason why we want to dispatch them in the real-time market time horizons is because conditions can change between day ahead and real time. So the closer we can do it to actual real-time conditions would be better because we would know a little bit more about what actual conditions are at that time.
I just wanted to make sure this option wasn't an off-the-table option for local in exchange for the pre-dispatch. So, okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Okay. Mark, go ahead.
And Lauren, one more follow-up. So if slow DR is dispatched by exceptional dispatch or through the MOC process, it does not set LMP. Is that right? Is there any circumstance where you would dispatch this stuff and it actually sets the LMP?
Yeah, so through the MOC process, it would not set the LMP. If it was dispatched through our market, economically, then it could set the LMP, but for this local pre-contingency dispatch process, using a MOC or an ED, then it would not.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll go back to the phone.
Hello, this is Habib Maiga with STG&E. So just a clarifying question on slide 144. When you have you list the import capability, are you talking about the MIC value or is it a different value?
This would be the import capability into the local capacity area.
So is it like a physical import capability or is it more like just the MIC, like historical import, into that area?
Catalan, I think, has a...
This is Catalan with the ISO. It will be whatever the nomogram dictates for that local area or sub-area. If the expected load for tomorrow compare with what the capability for that system is given the system conditions, generation and transmission combination of the two, it will give you a limit for that day, and whatever that limit is, it will trigger.
Okay, so it'll be like a physical import limit versus the MIC. So, okay, and I have another question.
This is Catalan. This is Catalan. Just make a clarification here. This has nothing to do with MIC. MIC is imports into the ISO control area. This will be triggered by the actual constraints in the local areas and sub areas. So for San Diego, it would be a San Diego import nomogram or some sub pocket 115 kV sub-pocket in San Diego that had some kind of a nomogram. This has nothing to do with MIC. MIC is imports into the ISO control area at Koi, Palo Verde, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
This is John Gooden. I just want to emphasize what Catalan said, because this is confusing. We do have import capability on this slide under the MSC, but again, like Catalan said, this is not at the inter-ties. This is intra-balancing area of the ISO, the transmission that is serving those particular local areas and how much transfer capability you have on those transmission ties going into these local areas. So that's an important clarification. These are not your sort of classic imports like Catalan said.
Okay. Did you have another question, or? Okay.
Christian, are there any other questions on the phone?
At this time, there are no other questions in the queue.
Thank you.
Okay. So the last slide I have on slow DR for local RA eligibility. Slow PDR must be dispatchable in the real-time market time horizons once the ESDR bidding options are implemented. So those bidding options will give block dispatches and extended notification, either 52.5 or 22.5, like I mentioned. We're also proposing that slow RDRR will not count for local RA because it cannot be dispatched by the CAISO prior to declaring a transmission emergency for local areas or a warning in other cases. And the CAISO can't plan the system assuming that we would need to declare a transmission emergency to meet our local requirements. So as we've been talking about, slow DR needs to be dispatched on a pre-contingency basis, and we can't really do that with RDRR. So that's why we're proposing that slow RDRR will not count for local. So that's all I have on slow DR. I'll pause one more time for questions if we have any, and then we can move on to CPM.
Christian, any other questions in the queue?
We do have a question in the queue.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Excuse me. Sorry, this is Paul Nelson with CLICA. Some of the local utilities have dispatch authority of RDRR programs, and some of them have actually been used to address local transmission issues and constraints. So they seem to be providing some local reliability value. I'll hesitate to use the word resource adequacy, but they certainly have local reliability value.
And Paul, this is John Gooden again with the ISO. Again, what you call deemed transmission, the ISO would deem that that's the utility, part of the utility distribution and sub-transmission system. It's not part of the ISO balancing area authority, and it's not subject to the same reliability requirements like NERC and WEC either, because it falls under the rules and jurisdiction of the PUC, not the FERC, WEC, NERC. So it's actually very different. And as you understand, the utilities have always had the right, and it's part of the settlement, to use their RDR resources for their own purposes on their own system. And that's what you saw up in Ukiah last year. That was not ISO, that was utility distribution and subtransmission. So let's not try to confuse that particular issue.
Just going by what's listed as the report, calling a local transmission emergency. This was the reason for the call, and they listed the sub area that was is utilized to resolve. So
just as I said, though, Paul,
there may be confusion on how it's being reported.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me just clarify that was PG&E system, not ISO.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, folks. I am Gabe Murtaugh, a Senior Policy Developer with the Infrastructure and Regulatory Policy Group here at the ISO. I'll be talking about backstop capacity procurement with regard to resource adequacy and what we've been talking about earlier. And a lot of the things like, and then I think after I'm done, I think that's the end of the program for today, so we can all, or the 2 days here, so we can all go home after that. So I'll try to make this as brief and painless as possible. What's that? Oh, yeah. A lot of the policy that's here in the backstop provisions is a continuation of what we put out in the last version of the paper. We've dove into a lot more details into some of these things, but by and large, the constructs from what we originally talked about haven't changed too much. So really, we're just kind of digging into the details. And I think as all the presenters have said before me, you know, we're still in a process of sussing this material out. So any kind of feedback that we have from market participants is helpful, and we're looking for that in this process. I also know that over the last 2 days, there's already been some conversations about backstop procurement, cost allocation, how these designations are going to be made, and to the best that I can, I'll try to answer those questions in this slide deck. But to the extent that some of those questions are still outstanding, we can talk about them here as well. So just to start, and this is the same slide we presented last time, these are the existing CPM authorities that the ISO currently has. This includes system deficiency authority, both in the annual and monthly timeframes. It includes local deficient authority, local collective deficiencies, cumulative flexible deficiencies, significant event, exceptional dispatch, and risk of retirement CPM as well. I will note that risk of retirement CPM has an asterisk by it in the RMR CPM Enhancements Initiative, which is currently awaiting FERC approval. We've requested that this authority be moved from a CPM authority over to an RMR authority. So that's currently in flux right now at FERC. So I'd say that authority is not something we anticipate in the future having under CPM. So the first 2 slides that I've got to present here include just kind of an overview of the additional authority that we're seeking with this initiative, and then I've got some additional slides going through some of the details on each one of those authorities. So I'll go through these 2 slides and just check if we have any questions. But to start with, we want to talk about additional authority for a system UCAP test. So we're envisioning a system UCAP test working very similarly to the way our NQC tests work for system requirements on an annual basis and a monthly basis. So essentially, if we have any kind of deficiency at a system level, the ISO will be able to backstop procure looking at the UCAP values and the sum of the UCAP shown versus the sum of the requirements. And if those requirements are greater than the actual showings, the ISO will have the authority under this proposal to go out and do CPMs for that. Of course, cost allocation would also work very similar to the cost allocation we have today for system procurements, and those would be allocated to deficient LFCs. And in a few slides, I have an example of how we would do such a calculation and allocation. And I just want to reemphasize that the authority that we're looking for would extend both the annual time frame and the monthly time frame. And I think Carl's alluded to this a couple times, but I do have a timeline that we walk through for when showings would be due, when the ISO would allow a cure period, and when we would be making designations as well. Also, we're requesting authority to do a portfolio deficiency CPM. So if we do this portfolio analysis that we're performing or we're proposing to perform, and we find that the system is unable to meet reliability needs, then we would request some authority to do a backstop procurement so that we could operate the system reliably. I think we had some specific questions on this as well, but the ISO sees that this is critical going forward, particularly with the changes in generation mix that we're anticipating in the next few years, and the changes that could result from the issues that could result in accounting practices that we currently have. And these costs will be allocated, if there's a designation made solely for portfolio deficiencies, these costs would be allocated on a load ratio share basis. And I know we had some questions earlier about, well, could these potentially be allocated to parties that are responsible for the deficiency? Currently, we don't have any way to kind of tell where those deficiencies are, so our best guess for this particular portion of CPM authority would be to just allocate those costs out on a load ratio share basis. So we're also requesting local availability limited deficiency CPM authority as well. This would work similar to the portfolio analysis that I was just talking about in the last bullet, where if on a local level now we see we have a certain load shape over the course of the month or the course of the year, we could potentially do, with these local capacity technical studies, we could potentially see shortfalls and deficiencies, and we'd like to have CPM authority for that in the event that there was some sort of an issue there where the ISO felt they wouldn't be able to operate the system reliably. And then finally, we're proposing a tool called the UCAP deficiency tool. UCAP deficiency tool would be a mechanism where if one LSE was showing below their requirements, they would essentially be charged a penalty price, and then those penalty revenues that are collected would then be allocated out to load-serving entities that are showing above their requirements. And I've got a few examples that sort of walk through that tool and how it could potentially work in a few slides. So I'm going to go ahead and get into the details here, but I do have slides that cover each of these individually, and then I'll take questions as we go along. So just to start with, wanted to talk a little bit about the UCAP CPM designations, and I've got an example here, but by and large this works very similar to the way we do system NQC deficiencies today. So in this very simple example, we've got 3 load-serving entities. The requirements for each of these load-serving entities is set at 100 megawatts. We've got load-serving entity 1 that's going to show 125 megawatts, and then load-serving entity 2 shows 80 megawatts and at a shortage of 20 megawatts, and then load-serving entity 3 shows 75 megawatts at a shortage of 25 megawatts. So in total, we can see that the total requirements for the system in this example are 300 megawatts. The total shown capacity is 280 megawatts. So we've got a 20 megawatt deficiency. In this case, the ISO will procure those 20 megawatts through the CPM, the UCAP CPM authority. And then as I already mentioned, there will be an opportunity, after we come up with these results and we do show that, hey, the ISO's requested 300 megawatts or there's been a 300 megawatt requirement set and there's been showings for 280 megawatts, we would, broadcast this, and there would be a period to cure before the ISO goes out and makes any backstop designations. And consistent with this proposal, this CPM authority will only apply to system deficiencies. It won't apply to local deficiencies. So if we have any questions on the UCAP CPM, yeah, Brian?
Again, thanks. Brian Thaker with NRG. Yesterday, the ISO presented a slide that said it was not going to allow LSEs to procure only the UCAP amount. The example they had, a 100-megawatt resource with a 10-megawatt forced outage rate would have 90 megawatts of UCAP, but you just simply couldn't buy the UCAP. Is the ISO going to extend that principle to CPM designations for UCAP deficiencies? So for example, with the example the ISO had, if it needed 90 megawatts of UCAP, it would still issue a CPM for 100 megawatts.
Oh, I think that's a good question. The idea would be that we procure the UCAP that we need. So if in this case, there's, and maybe I'm not answering this, but if we have a shortage here of 20 megawatts, the ISO would go out and make a 20 megawatt of the UCAP designation.
So that seems inconsistent with the slide 42.
So,
Carl, you want to?
So, Brian, at the end of the day, I can't say that I'm going to buy 100 megawatts of NQC. I can tell you that I can buy, that if I'm buying 90 megawatts of UCAP, I can get that from a really, really, really good, reliable resource that has, 95 megawatts of installed capacity, or a less reliable resource that has 150 megawatts of installed capacity. At the end of the day, the installed capacity is, it's going to be what it's going to be, but we need to make sure that we've got sufficient UCAP available to meet the need, and that's what we're targeting for. So how much installed capacity comes with that, you can't seek that out.
Well, again, I'm just reacting to the ISO's proposal that says you can't simply buy you have to, in order to get an equivalent amount of UCAP, you have to effectively procure NQC that gets you to that UCAP. And I'm just asking if the ISO is extending that principle to a CPM designation. You can't just CPM the UCAP first. Yeah, okay. Are we violently agreeing?
I think so.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so this is Chris, too. I just want to add to this discussion, the same way that we included the proposal on the must-offer obligation. If we got, 80 megawatts of NQC from 100 megawatt of installed capacity, we would still have 100 megawatts of must-offer obligation associated with that. So it is trying to be consistent there, Brian.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I was slow to pick up on the fact that we were violently agreeing.
Yeah. Peter.
Yeah, Peter Griffiths, PG&E. Under this example, doesn't LSE 1 have an incentive not to show more than what its requirement is? Because essentially it's giving that away to the deficient LSEs at zero cost. And so if you're going to be able to have the substitution or to have the requirement to do the makeup, I'm confused as to why this example doesn't violate your principle of having LSEs show everything they have under contract.
Well, let's get to the proposal for the UCAP deficiency test or the UCAP deficiency tool, and then maybe circle back around to this question. But yeah, any other questions? Anything on the line?
Christian, do we have any questions in the queue?
At this time, there are no questions in the queue.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. All right. So on the next slide, we've just got some details here about the portfolio analysis tool and the authority that the ISO is seeking for CPM, the ability to CPM for a deficiency in the portfolio analysis. But essentially, what the portfolio analysis is saying is that during any given hour in a month or any interval in a month, there could be an issue with the amount of resources that we have procured, and I think we've been talking a lot about this concept over these last few days. But with the mix of resources that are procured, it may not meet the energy needs that the ISO system has at times, and that's the whole idea behind the portfolio analysis. So if there is a deficiency that's identified through that analysis, the ISO needs some kind of a tool to be able to earmark or make sure that sufficient resources are there so that we can meet the energy needs that we have during that interval. So that's what the whole point of this authority is. And the idea is, and I think, like I've just been saying, that authority may not necessarily align with the UCAP analysis that we've been doing, where we're procuring to a certain number of megawatts for UCAP, because those, well, like we've said, if it's all solar resources, yes, it has a certain amount of UCAP, but that UCAP may not be effective at meeting energy needs all hours, particularly the hours when the sun's not up. The CAISO may also make backstop designations to ensure that we can meet aggregate energy needs for the system, and this isn't just focused on the one peak hour that the ISO needs to serve during a month or during any specific interval a year or so. The details of the portfolio analysis in this proposal continue to be discussed. So I think not all of the details of how the ISO is going to be performing the portfolio analysis are in place right now, and we are currently developing those. So obviously, the implementation decisions that we make for the portfolio analysis will have an impact on what kind of resources and how frequently we might be using this authority. So those two pieces of the proposal sort of go hand in hand. And just keep in mind, as we are developing our proposal on how we implement this portfolio analysis, the downstream impact could be, well, if we implement it one way, that could imply more or less backstop procurement down the road. But the idea would be that any kind of portfolio analysis that we do would show us a load pattern, and the ISO would like to make sure we have resources available to meet load during all hours of the day, essentially. Of course, the ISO is going to continue to publish any kind of study that we've done, including information on portfolio analysis. When we do make a designation, we anticipate that we would put out some information. I think earlier we've had a conversation about what exactly would be published and how much of the portfolio analysis, the actual model could be shared with stakeholders. I don't think we've got a real clear picture about that. I think it's unlikely that we share the entire model, but if there's a deficiency, we will identify that. We will allow for a cure period for ISO load-serving entities, and then finally, the ISO will be making backstops and announcing how much we make in backstops and why we made the backstop, if we do. So questions on portfolio authority? Yeah, Mark.
Thanks, Mark with Alpine. I don't envy you trying to put together this portfolio analysis. You're going to have to make, I think, enormous, maybe heroic assumptions. For instance, how batteries are charged or discharged across the peak. Yeah. What resources have what kinds of limitations. Hopefully that's going to be a really public process as you develop that analysis and that portfolio analysis. But it's just a comment. It's not really a question at this point.
Yeah, Mark.
I'm very, very curious as to how you're going to approach that.
I think that's a valid comment, and we do want to continue the dialogue with our stakeholders, and internally we're certainly having a lot of conversations about this. Obviously, we've got a lot of experience in operating the grid and managing the grid, so we're trying to leverage that as much as we possibly can when we're doing this, so that we are careful and thoughtful about how this model unfolds.
Mark, just to add on to that, again, from the space where this is Carl from the ISO, we're looking at production simulations, so trying to think about where batteries are charged or not charged over time. I mean, the model will tell us that. I mean, that's one of the benefits of that, is we'll be able to see that. The question about understanding and knowing some of the use limitations that may exist in the resource, to the extent that we have opportunity cost adders into those resources, that'll be very helpful. So our goal really is to, quite frankly, not make heroic input assumptions into this. It is to really, work with the CEC's hourly load forecasts, to have an interface between Sierra and the production simulation model, so that there's a straight consumption from Sierra into the model. Again, just to add detail to what Gabe said earlier, we can't provide the entire model. We can't. We're looking at something that is our proprietary software to run this, so we wouldn't be providing all of that. But again, our efforts are to not make this any more complicated than it already will be.
Yep.
Christian, do we have any questions on the phone? Sorry, Gabe.
At this time, there are no questions in the queue.
Thank you.
Super. So moving on, we've spent a little bit of time working on an updated timeline for the ISO's procurement process for CPM, and sort of an idea of a timeline when this portfolio analysis would happen. I would mention and caveat here that this is a fluid process. We're still in progress here. As we haven't developed the portfolio analysis, we're not positive how much time it's going to take. We believe, and I think Carl joked about this yesterday, that we can likely get the analysis done in 10 days, but that's speculative at this point. Start of the month, 60 days prior to the start of the month, we will receive, as we do today, the CEC monthly forecast update, which would be how our requirements are set and when our requirements are set. T-minus 45 would still be the period when the RA showings would be due. At that point, we would anticipate a 10-day period for the ISO to validate the plans and for any plan updates would happen in that window. And then we are also, as I indicated, anticipating about a 10-day window to run a portfolio analysis at this time. After that, we're sort of allowing for or anticipating about a 5-day cure period if there are any deficiencies found in the portfolio analysis. And then after that, and this will get us down from 20 days prior to the start of the month to about 15 days prior to the start of the month. That's when the ISO would be making month-ahead CPM designations. And then to some of the planned outage items, planned outage would start running daily at about, as soon as those designations are made, at about 14 days prior to the start of the month. We're still anticipating leaving the 7 days prior to the start of the month as a deadline to finalize outages for the real-time market. And then the start of the month, obviously, and around the start of the month would also be a time frame for the ISO to make near-term CPM designations, so the exceptional dispatch designations would still happen sort of in that time frame. Any questions on the timeline? Okay, and like I said, we're still working on this, but here's our general thoughts, and for those market participants who have any concerns about this, please feel free to include those in my comments. I know earlier in our discussions we've had some comments already and thoughts about how CPM cost designations would work. And this is currently how the ISO, this chart here currently outlines how the cost designations would work. It's how the ISO currently does CPM cost designation, and it's sort of an expansion of that to include the new portfolio analysis and the new UCAP deficiency CPM as well. So the idea would be that we would first target individually deficient areas, and any CPMs that were made would sort of funnel into those individually deficient folks first, and then after those individual deficiencies are cured, and again, this is only referring to cost allocation. But after the individual deficiencies are cured and those costs are allocated, then we would sort of do the allocations for local areas. Then after those allocations were made, then we would do allocations on a load ratio share basis for the portfolio deficiencies if we found any of those. Now, as far as how the ISO would actually make the procurements, so if we identified a particular reliability issue and the ISO felt that we needed to procure for that, and perhaps we had many deficiencies that we needed to procure for, so maybe there was a local issue, maybe there was a system issue, and maybe there was an issue that was brought up by the portfolio analysis, the ISO would take all that information and internalize it. We would determine what the least cost resources would be to cure those deficiencies. We would procure those resources, and then the costs would be allocated in this manner. So I can take questions on this slide if there are any. I feel like there's a lot of information in here. Anything on the phone? Okay. Okay. We'll take that as consent that we want to wrap this up. Okay. So finally, and I think this gets to a question we were thinking about just a minute ago, the ISO is proposing a UCAP deficiency tool. The idea here is that this would be a tool that would incentivize resources to show up to their requirements and potentially show above their requirements. So backstop authority is obviously used to ensure that enough UCAP is being procured to meet the system needs that we have. And this UCAP deficiency tool is going to disincentivize load-serving entities from leaning or free riding on neighbors. So if I'm a load-serving entity and I know my neighbor is going to over-procure because my neighbor always over-procures, and there's not going to be a system deficiency, well, the ISO is not going to make any kind of backstop if there's no system deficiency. We're not going to go out and procure additional resources that we don't necessarily need to meet system requirements if there's no problem there. So in order to prevent that, the ISO's sort of thought about this tool, and we've developed that. But essentially, if a load-serving entity does not show up to its full requirements, the difference between the requirements and the megawatts shown will be charged to that resource, and they'll be charged at the soft offer cap for CPM, or the competitive solicitation process for the CPM, and that money collected, or those penalties collected, would then be reallocated to any entities that are showing above their UCAP requirements. So this, and essentially this last bullet would just say that this process is self-funded. So any monies that are coming in would be immediately dispersed. There wouldn't be any kind of carryover from month to month. So theoretically, this hopefully would be relatively easy to implement. I say that full well knowing that things in the past that we thought have been easy to implement weren't necessarily so. Eric.
Eric from Edison, just a quick question. If the ISO had to do strictly a UCAP deficiency backstop procurement, is the ISO going to do that procurement strictly on a least cost basis?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yeah, Mark.
Okay, so going back to the table, that in my slides is on 151. Somehow or other they got changed.
This guy? Yeah.
Yeah, it's on 151 years too. Okay, good.
We've converged.
So LSE1, under this scenario, since the 25 megawatts that they showed beyond their UCAP obligation would be paid the CPM soft offer cap?
So let's go here. Let's go to Mark. Let me get back to that in just 1 second. See if we have any other questions on this in particular. Okay. So let's go on to the next slide. So we've got a situation that looks relatively similar, I think. Yeah, we've got a situation here that looks relatively similar, I hope, in example number 1. Well, let me actually, I'm going to skip ahead to example number 3. So in example number 3, we've got 3 LSCs again. We've got LSC number 1, LSC number 2, LSC number 3. We've got a requirement of 100 megawatts, 100 megawatts, and 100 megawatts. But we've got these resources showing in aggregate below their requirements. So the resources are showing 90 megawatts, 85 megawatts, and then one resource or one entity, LSE3, is showing 105 megawatts or 5 megawatts above. So we've got a total system deficiency of 20 megawatts, and then we're going to say the ISO is going to make a CPM designation for that 20 megawatts. So when we do that, we're effectively going to be allocating those 20 megawatts out to the 2 entities that were short. So in this case, entity number 1 was short 10 megawatts, and entity number 2 was short 15 megawatts. So entity number 1 would be allocated 8 megawatts of that 20 megawatt designation, and entity number 2 would be allocated 12 megawatts. And then we'd calculate the deficiency from those numbers. Then we'd have a deficiency of 2 megawatts from LSC number 1, and we'd have a deficiency of 3 megawatts from LSC number 2, and each of those would be charged the soft offer cap penalty of $6.31 per kW a month, and then that credit for those the aggregate 5 megawatts times $6.31 would be credited towards LSE3, which was showing above the requirements. But in anticipation of that question, I threw this example in. Yeah.
Eric from Edison, and you may not have this example, but I assume what ends up happening in the situation where suppose LSE3, instead of having 105, you were short 25 in total?
Yep.
What if they showed 130?
Yep.
Would they be paid 25 megawatts at 631?
They would.
Okay.
Yep.
And if you had multiple LSEs who were long, would you just pro rata between them?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So if one was long 10 megawatts and one was long 20 megawatts, the 20 megawatt long one would get 2/3 of the penalty collected, and the other one would get 1/3.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. You're welcome. So very briefly, I don't see any other questions in the room. we're actually going to backtrack a little bit here and just walk through very quickly example number 1 and example number 2. So example 1, I think, is similar to the question we may have just asked, where we have LSE 3, which is short by 10 megawatts, and then LSE 1 and LSE 2 showing 10 megawatts and 15 megawatts over respectively. You can see LSE 3 has charged the penalty here for the 10 megawatts, so it's the 631 times the 10 megawatts, which gets you to 63,000 and change, and that's allocated out on that share ratio basis for the showings above the requirements to the entities number 1 and entities number 2. Similarly, we just included example 2 in here to show if there weren't any entities. So you've kind of got this situation where entities could show just at the requirements and not above the requirements. That happens. The ISO is not planning on doing any kind of allocation or charges in that case to the other entities. We may, however, in this example number 2, make a backstop CPM for a UCAP system deficiency here, which could be allocated out to the 2 LSEs that were deficient. And actually, that is the last slide I have with these examples, so I can take any questions on backstop procurement at this time if we have any. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so if an LSE goes out and buys up the capacity or whatever, and these other LSEs can't come up with the capacity and are not willing to sell it to them, so they're just going to sit there and collect, the cap for the market?
Well, I think, yeah. So what we're proposing is that this UCAP efficiency tool would be something that says, if I'm an LSE and I've got a certain amount of requirements that I have to hit, you better hit those requirements or there will be a penalty charge involved.
Right, but I mean, you're basically saying I'm going to charge them the max, and then there's an incentive. All I'm saying is that somebody might go out and just buy up all the capacity in that particular place, right?
Well, yeah.
Because then they're going to sell it to you for $631. They own all the capacity.
So this is Carl from the ISO. I want to make sure I understand. Are we talking about concerns or kind of concepts of I'm going to corner the capacity market and just sit there and reap the rewards of being long, or just trying to understand kind of what the game.
Where's there an incentive for that LSE that's holding excess capacity to?
Well, I think they're also sitting there
for less than the market cap.
Well, they may not be getting the market cap, remember, because, again, to the extent that other LSEs are long, depending on how we ultimately develop this tool, as Gabe noted, they may be getting some small share of that cap. So if they're getting, let's say 2/3 or a third of it, or let's use half because I'm just easier math, and they're going to be getting about $3, then that's the opportunity cost of holding it, right, is however long they would expect to be.
Yeah, but I think that's a fair question. Jamie?
Jamie PZ. I guess I'm trying to wrap my brain around how this would work with the LRA's, citation program, and I'm just seeing it as being duplicative of what we're doing already from the LRA standpoint. And so I'm an LSE and I'm going out and I'm determining whether I want to come in short. Well, I got the CPUC's penalty, and now I have the ISO's penalty. So it's 631 plus whatever the CPUC's penalty is, which is 666 for system. That's what I will pay. That's my cap of what I will pay the market price. Is that what you're trying to do in having another penalty added to LSE procurement? Or am I missing something?
So we certainly want to open up the dialogue with the CPUC, and we want to think about how these penalty prices could interact with the caps and the penalties that the CPUC sets and enforces. And I don't think we want to have duplicative pricing, but we do want to have that dialogue, and we'll be open and frank that we haven't had that yet.
What is driving this need to have an additional deficiency, like LSE deficiency? I mean, I get the collective CPM. You need enough to run the system to be under contract. But why are you going out and issuing or trying to duplicate the LRA's role?
Well, one of the nice things about this tool that we've developed here is that it will, reallocate those charges to the resources that are showing long. So there is an incentive to show above your requirements, and there's also, perhaps a stronger incentive to not show below your requirements. So that's sort of where we were thinking on this, and we do want to prevent the leaning. I think Carl wants to add something here too.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to that, Jamie. Yes, many LRAs have programs such as what you're talking about. Most of the PUC jurisdictionals, not all of them do. And so what we're looking to do is set up an incentive that will avoid leaning, but B, also have an incentive to say, I've got additional capacity under contract. I might as well put it out there because, hey, there's no benefit to it. It's not simply looking at the downside of showing capacity. It's trying to say there's actual upside to putting contracted capacity on an RA showing. Now, again, as Gabe noted, our goal is most definitely not to create duplicative penalties, and we need to talk about how that would work or could work. And there's a couple of different ways it could. But again, trying to make sure that there's not entities out there that may not have some of the same provisions leaning on other LSE's procurement.
Right. So sorry, Eric, but so it's really one of the reasons is that there could be some concern that the munis are leaning on the CPUC jurisdictional. Is that like the leaning you're talking about? Because there wouldn't be leaning because we already created a penalty structure for the CPUC jurisdictional, so there's not leaning. There's already incentive for them to not lean on the system.
Right, and so that is what you've identified as one example. The other scenario is one where, again, part of the collaborative process could be to simplify some of the PUC penalty structures to rely on this so that it's more singularly applicable and not have multiple standards across LRAs, so that you could say, well, we're going to not have those penalties. We'll simply know that the ISO has those rules in place, and they'll manage the leaning penalties from some of the LSEs.
I guess I have reservations about that. I mean, are you saying that we get rid of our citation program?
I'm saying it's something to explore as an option. I'm not saying it's the solution.
And this is Chris. I'll just jump in too and add. I think I want to stress that we were really intending, to create that incentive for people to be able to show more than what their requirement is, because we've been talking about that, on a number of occasions throughout the principles here, and that's one of the main drivers behind this. But it's not just about, the idea of leaning, but since we do have other LRAs that there's a potential for that, we think it could address that as well.
Okay, I think this is for everybody's benefit. I just want to add a little bit more of a wrinkle to this issue of non-showing RA that was recently kind of identified, is that we have retail choice in California, and there's something called the PCIA. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the PCIA, and portfolio optimization going on by the utilities and how much they sell to the market. And so, there's a disincentive for the utility to show a resource that it didn't sell on their RA filing. And so that feeds into this problem that we're trying to solve is, why would they show excess if then that would be valued at a benchmark price versus a zero or a strike price, depending on what comes out of the PCIA. So that's another wrinkle in this problem we're trying to solve.
Greatly appreciate that, Jamie. I think we'll have to sit down and talk with you all about a bit more detail about PCIA and how it would work in this space. It's not something that we fully considered, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those comments. Appreciate it. Eric?
Yeah, Eric from Medicine. So I do think that the PCIA wrinkle needs to be addressed, because that is something that, honestly, in my opinion, PCIA did not contemplate this potential change in RA, just plain and simple. But I do want to mention that I'm not sure that this mechanism is all that different from the way that it could work out today, right? Today, technically, I could call leaning somebody not showing something and waiting for the ISO to go backstop it. That's leaning. I'm leaning on the ISO. I'm not leaning on another LSE. In that case, I would be subject to the PUC $6.66, and I would be subject to paying the ISO whatever the backstop cost was. Effectively, we're doing the same thing here and saying, well, now the ISO doesn't have to go about and CPM it because the resource is already there. But you didn't procure it, you shouldn't get away with not paying the cost of the reliability of the resource. The $6.66 penalty was really to say you needed to make an effort to where you didn't end up there. And then as far as the issue of it providing disincentive for somebody to sell the resource, I agree with Carl that if I know that a lot of people have an excess, I can either sell it today for a price certain and get rid of that excess position, or I could wait and go into the monthlies and find out that it was worth nothing because everybody met their numbers. So I don't think that there's an incentive to hang on to it and hope that the ISO pays me a nice juicy $6.31 premium for it. I think that there's plenty of incentive to sell off excess positions, and then plenty of incentive for entities to go out and buy the correct amount of resources because they face both a penalty and a backstop cost, whether that backstop is through a sharing or through the ISO doing a CPM.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. Appreciate it. Yeah, we'll take that.
Christian, we'll take the question on the phone.
Hey, this is Matt Barmack. I just had a clarifying question. So under this proposed UCAP deficiency tool, if there was an LSE that overshowed and there was one that was short, you would use the overshown capacity at 631 even if there were potentially cheaper capacity offered into the CSP? I guess that's the question. I mean, suppose you had a $5 offer instead of, you know, sort of the 631 implicit offer through the deficiency tool.
Yeah, Matt. The idea here is that this is strictly a penalty price. It doesn't actually have anything to do with the procurement. So in this example that we have on our slide 157, we do make a procurement for 20 megawatts, and that 20 megawatt, the ISO makes a CPM procurement for 20 megawatts, and that 20 megawatt procurement may not be at the $6.31 soft offer cap. It may be something much less than that, but it would be through the CSP process, as you've noted. But after we've made the 20 megawatt procurement, there's still that extra 5 megawatts that has been shown by LSE 3 that LSEs 1 and 2 cumulatively are deficient by. So in that case, the idea here would be that there's a penalty price for that 5 megawatt cumulative deficiency that's applied to those two LSEs, and that penalty revenue that's collected is then credited to LSE 3.
I mean, maybe this is a semantic issue, but it seems like kind of the order is reversed. Like first you see how much extra you have in the showings, and then you go out, you know, you go to the CSP for any remaining amount that you need. And you know, to me the 5 megawatt of penalty and the 5 megawatt of credit looks a lot like LSE 3 selling at 631 and LSEs 1 and 2 buying at 631. I'm just
Matt, this is Carl.
That, you know, there's potentially a cheaper way of meeting the deficiency for LSEs 1 and 2 in this example.
Matt, this is Carl, and in that instance, why would LSE 1 and 2 not go out and pay the cheaper capacity price in the open market instead of waiting to CPM land to do so? And so, I think our point here is simply we assume that they've exhausted all opportunities to procure capacity for a price less than 631, because otherwise they would have done so. And so using the soft offer cap at that point makes sense.
I mean, I guess I'm not really opposed to that, but I mean, you might know that there's actually cheaper capacity available based on, you know, the CSP offers, right?
We might, yeah, that's possible.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for the comment, Matt. I appreciate it. Stephen.
Yeah, this is Stephen with IEP. Just because, as I understood how you would implement this, if there were a deficiency that you were procuring for, you would go out and buy the least cost resource to fill that deficiency.
That's right.
Those costs are going to be allocated. And then you have this penalty adder to the deficient LSEs that would then be allocated based on your ratio. Is that?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. I'll just add the one thing that I think, following up on what Jamie was saying at the PUC having a penalty price, the one thing, as I understand it, that is different here is that you are setting market signals closer before the market has actually engaged, where the PUC comes in way late and makes a determination on a waiver request or whatever it is after the fact. So I actually think there's some attraction to moving forward in the market to incent people to behave properly.
Thanks for that comment. Appreciate it. Anything else on the phone? Hey. We'll make sure she knows. Any other questions on the phone?
Christian, are there any other questions in the queue?
At this time, there are no further questions.
Okay, that's all the slides I have, so I'll turn it over to Christina.
All right. Well, thank you all. We really appreciate all the comments that we received over the last couple of days. I know it's a lot of information to digest. We look forward to receiving your comments, your written comments, actually, July 24th. We did post a comments template out on the initial webpage, so please use that when submitting your comments. It does go into the more granular level than just a high-level topic. So, and Carl has some comments on that.
Yeah, so we realize that what we've put out to stakeholders over the past week, today and yesterday, and then the proposal has been a lot to chew on. We're looking for, we expect one of the requests will be to start to divvy the project up, or the things we can spin off and spin out. But what we want to know as we go through this is, are there priority areas that our stakeholders have that they want us to really focus on, that they feel need to be resolved more quickly based on what we've put out and what's in the scope? And if there are any other subjects that, can stand in isolation as their own stakeholder process, and again, maybe for a more expeditious resolution. So when you're going through your stakeholder comments, please let us know what your biggest ticket items are that we've identified, and if you think we can spin a couple items off and get those solved out quicker. But again, when making those comments, please be cognizant of the interconnected nature of many aspects of the proposal when trying to work through that.
Great, thanks, Carl. And then we do have a more detailed schedule in the revised straw proposal, so kind of reference that for the exact dates of when we're planning to put out the second revised straw proposal. But we are planning to host another 2-day, maybe 3-day workshop in September. And so the dates are in that proposal. And the meeting recordings for this session will be available probably at the end of this week. So if you want to go back and listen to it all over again, you're welcome to do that. So thank you all again for joining us. Safe travels home. And again, we'll look forward to your comments.